Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the cold, icy depths of one of the most enigmatic and colossal empires of the 20th century, the Soviet Union. Picture it: 1917, Russia in flames, revolution everywhere, the smell of change in the air. The Tsar is gone, the world is teetering on the edge of war, and something new is about to rise from the ashes. The Soviets. The word alone probably makes you think of military parades, thick beards, and a certain level of paranoia. And sure, there was plenty of that. But before all that chaos, something simpler happened. The Russian Empire fell, and the Bolsheviks picked up the pieces. But don't get comfortable. This isn't a fairy tale, and you probably won't survive this history lesson without a few uncomfortable facts along the way. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Where are you watching from? Pop your location and local time in the comments. I'm always curious about where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Soviet Union wasn't built overnight, but by the end of 1917, it had managed to claw its way into existence. The Russian Empire had been under the thumb of Tsar Nicholas II, a leader who was, let's just say, not the best at keeping things together. The country was in turmoil, racked with poverty, political unrest, and a disastrous war effort during World War I. The people were desperate for change. Along came the Bolsheviks, a radical Marxist group led by the now famous Vladimir Lenin. They promised a revolution that would take Russia from the claws of the aristocracy to the gleaming future of socialism. Lenin and his comrades didn't just hope for change, they took it. With the overthrow of the Romanov dynasty, the Russian Empire crumbled, and in its place, the Soviet Union was born. The transition was anything but easy. In fact, it was full of violence, with the country immediately plunged into a brutal civil war between the Bolsheviks and the anti-Bolshevik forces. This was the Russian Civil War, and it was exactly as chaotic and bloody as you'd imagine. Lenin's forces, the Red Army, fought the White Army and other factions across a landscape littered with dead bodies, famine, and chaos. The Red Army, led by the iron will of Leon Trotsky, eventually emerged victorious, but the cost was staggering. Tens of thousands of lives were lost in the war, and Russia, already a broken nation, was left in ruins. By 1922, the Soviet Union officially came into existence, but the cracks were already showing. The Soviet leadership, after all, wasn't exactly a smooth-running machine. Lenin had promised the people a utopia, but things were going to get much, much darker before they could get better. Historians still argue whether the revolution was truly about creating a workers' paradise or simply about seizing power for a new ruling elite. But one thing is certain: Lenin's rule, though transformative, was not without its faults, and the legacy of the revolution would ripple through the next 70 years in ways no one could have predicted. Remember those old Soviet propaganda posters with people waving their fists triumphantly? That's the image we usually associate with the rise of the USSR. But behind those images was a different reality. A country plagued by violence, famine, and political purges that would come in the years to follow. The revolutionary fervor that had ignited in the streets of Petrograd would soon give way to something much more sinister. Now that we've set the stage, it's time to shift focus a little. Let's talk about the man who would come to define the Soviet Union for decades. That man, of course, is Joseph Stalin. By the late 1920s, Lenin had died, surprisingly, not of a bullet to the head, as many feared, but after suffering a stroke. A power vacuum opened up, and that's when Stalin, a man who had previously been a minor player in the revolution, seized control. He wasn't the charismatic or idealistic figure that Lenin was, but Stalin had something else: raw, calculated ambition. Historians still argue whether Stalin's rise was purely strategic, or if he had always been a ruthless, power-hungry leader, but one thing's for sure: he knew how to manipulate those around him. Stalin's first major action upon assuming control was a push for collectivization. Now, let's break this down. Stalin wanted to consolidate farms, the lifeblood of Soviet agriculture, into large state-run collectives. The idea was that by pooling resources, they could produce more efficiently and support the growing industrial needs of the country. But there was a catch: this was not a smooth transition. Farmers, particularly in the Ukraine, resisted the forced collectivization. Stalin, ever the pragmatist, took a brutal approach to persuade them. He didn't just send out friendly memos and pamphlets. No, Stalin had them rounded up, imprisoned, and in some cases, executed. The infamous Holodomor famine in Ukraine, which saw millions starve, is often seen as a direct result of Stalin's policies. Some historians even argue that the famine was a deliberate act of genocide, although that's still a point of debate. Of course, Stalin didn't stop there. If you were on his bad side, even if you were a Soviet hero from the revolution, you were at risk. As the 1930s rolled in, the Great Purge began. Stalin launched a campaign to root out enemies of the state, real or imagined. The KGB was out in full force, and people were arrested, tortured, and executed for the slightest suspicion of disloyalty. Stalin's paranoia was so intense that even members of his inner circle weren't safe. Some of the most prominent Bolshevik leaders, once his closest allies, were executed. The most famous example? Leon Trotsky, Lenin's second-in-command and a leading figure in the revolution, was exiled and later assassinated in Mexico by Stalin's agents. This all sounds like the stuff of dystopian novels, right? But it was reality for millions in the Soviet Union. People lived in constant fear, knowing that a neighbor, friend, or even a family member could be denounced at any moment. One could be accused of espionage or simply being too bourgeois. The state's reach was terrifyingly omnipresent. Even in the most private corners of life, the government was watching. However, while the purges were a nightmare for Soviet citizens, Stalin's rule wasn't all about fear. The Soviet Union also saw rapid industrialization during this time. While millions starved or were sent to labor camps, the country's factories boomed. The USSR was quickly becoming a global power, and this industrial strength would eventually play a pivotal role in the Soviet Union's ability to withstand World War II. Historians still debate whether Stalin's industrialization was ultimately a success. On one hand, the USSR's economy grew dramatically, with new factories springing up across the country. But the costs were staggering. Millions of lives were lost, whether through famine, forced labor, or execution. By the end of the 1930s, Stalin had solidified his hold on power, but at an immense human cost. It was a ruthless, terrifying time, and for many, survival was the only option. Speaking of survival, let's not forget that Stalin's regime wasn't all about oppression and suffering. There were also those strange quirks, like the rise of Soviet cinema and art during the 1930s. While Stalin was busy purging political rivals, filmmakers were tasked with making movies that glorified the state. If you've ever seen a Soviet-era propaganda film, you'll know they were a little over the top. But hey, at least people were entertained, right? Of course, Stalin's reign would eventually lead the Soviet Union into a much larger conflict, the Second World War, but we'll get to that in just a bit. First, remember this. Stalin wasn't just a paranoid, ruthless dictator. He was a man who understood the power of fear and propaganda. He knew that to build a powerful state, you needed more than just factories. You needed control over people's minds. And that's exactly what he got. We've now touched on the grim side of Stalin's reign, but life in the Soviet Union didn't stop for the people caught under his iron grip. Let's take a moment to focus on what everyday life looked like for ordinary Soviet citizens during the 1930s, a decade defined by intense fear, but also a strange sense of resilience. The Soviet government, while terrifying, was also pushing for a better life for workers, in their own way, and Soviet citizens were expected to embrace this vision, whether they liked it or not. It was a world where survival, conformity, and resilience coexisted. To give you a glimpse into this, imagine waking up in the morning to the smell of stale bread, and the cold air creeping through your cramped apartment in the concrete block buildings that would soon dominate Soviet cities. Maybe you have a small family, maybe you don't. Either way, you'd be living under constant scrutiny. The government was in your home, your workplace, and even your dreams. At work, if you weren't meeting your production quotas, you could be fired, blacklisted, or worse. The same went for the educational system. Schools weren't just about learning to read and write. They were about learning loyalty to the state, reciting Stalin's speeches, and memorizing party slogans. Life under Stalin wasn't easy by any stretch of the imagination, and it wasn't just about being politically compliant. There were also shortages everywhere. Food, clothing, and consumer goods were incredibly scarce. You could wait in line for hours, even days, to buy a loaf of bread or a new coat. The Soviet state had a way of rationing resources that left many citizens hungry or lacking basic necessities. People would trade in black markets or barter just to make ends meet. The state tried to promise a better life through its 5-year plans, but the reality often didn't match the ideals. And while the government made grand proclamations about equality, the reality was far from it. Certain people, like party officials, lived much better lives than ordinary citizens. Historians still argue whether the Soviet Union's collectivization and industrialization were necessary sacrifices for the greater good. Some say these were essential for the country to become a superpower, while others point to the millions who suffered and died under these policies. One thing is certain: the Soviet citizens, those who survived, had to live through the constant tension between state propaganda and the harsh, often crushing, reality of their lives. But amid all the hardship, the people adapted. They found ways to survive, to make do, and sometimes to even find small moments of joy. In the evenings, after work, families might gather around for tea, or even the rare moment of entertainment, movies, books, or music that had to conform to state guidelines but still offered brief escapes from the oppressive atmosphere. Then, of course, there was the ever-present propaganda. In the newspapers, on the radio, in posters plastered across the streets, everything you saw told you that life in the Soviet Union was great. You were told that the USSR was a utopia, a shining example of socialism at work. But the reality often looked much different. The people had to get used to the disconnect. What they were told in public wasn't what they experienced in private. And yet, despite everything, there was a sense of community. The party might have tried to control everything, but the Soviet people found ways to come together, whether it was through work collectives, neighborhood gatherings, or even secret conversations in the shadows. They learned how to endure in a world where being openly critical of the government could get you sent to a labor camp, or worse. Some even found humor in their predicament. Dark humor, yes, but humor all the same. It wasn't uncommon to hear jokes about Stalin or the government, often whispered in hushed tones but shared all the same. It's a reminder that no matter how oppressive a system is, the human spirit has a remarkable ability to find a way to resist, even if it's just through a joke. As harsh as it was, this era also saw some cultural shifts. One of the most interesting things about life in Stalin's Soviet Union was the way people still clung to the arts, even under heavy censorship. You had Soviet filmmakers creating movies about heroic workers and brave soldiers who embodied the Soviet ideals. You had writers who pushed the boundaries of what was allowed, sneaking in subtle critiques of the regime. And, of course, music. Music was a powerful tool of the state, used to unite people under the banner of socialism, but it also gave the people a way to escape. The Soviet Union had a deep tradition of classical music, and composers like Dmitri Shostakovich became symbols of resistance, creating works that were meant to please the state, but also, at times, subtly criticized the regime. For all of Stalin's efforts to create a totalitarian state, he couldn't control everything. People still found ways to push back, however quietly. It was as if there was a constant tug-of-war between the state and the individual. The Soviet Union, despite its authoritarian nature, wasn't a completely repressive place. It was a paradox, a place where people were forced to live under a cloud of fear, but also where they found ways to survive and even thrive in their own small ways. As we move on, remember that while Stalin's rule defined the Soviet Union in so many ways, the story of the USSR was far from over. The 1940s were approaching, and they would bring an entirely new chapter, a time of war, heroism, and incredible sacrifice. All right, let's fast forward a bit. Stalin may have had his grip on the Soviet Union, but in the early 1940s, the USSR would face its greatest test, World War II. The war would shape the very identity of the Soviet Union, leaving scars that would take decades to heal. So, let's set the stage. 1941. The world is at war, and the Soviet Union, despite its vast territory, is fighting for survival. The Soviet Union entered the war after Hitler's infamous invasion in June 1941, known as Operation Barbarossa. The German forces launched one of the most significant military invasions in history, and they quickly pushed deep into Soviet territory. Stalin, who had once believed that Hitler wouldn't dare break the non-aggression pact they had signed, was caught off guard. The Soviet Union's vast landmass and poorly prepared defenses meant that the Germans were able to advance quickly, capturing major cities and cutting off large sections of the Soviet population from the rest of the country. Historians still argue about how unprepared the Soviet Union was for the German invasion. Some claim that Stalin's purges in the 1930s had decimated the Soviet military leadership, leaving it vulnerable. Others argue that the USSR's vast size and brutal winter weather were key factors in its survival. Regardless, things weren't looking good for the Soviet Union at first. Cities like Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, and Stalingrad, now St. Petersburg, and Stalingrad became major battlegrounds, with millions of Soviet soldiers and civilians caught in the crossfire. Life in the Soviet Union during World War II was nothing short of brutal. If you weren't fighting on the front lines, you were living under constant air raids, food shortages, and the constant fear of the Nazis advancing closer. Civilians were drafted into the war effort in various ways, often working in factories, growing food, or even taking up arms if necessary. Women, who had already contributed to Soviet industry and agriculture during Stalin's time, now became a vital part of the workforce and military. By 1942, women made up nearly 50% of the Soviet workforce, and many even served in combat roles, like snipers or pilots, in what was one of the most extensive uses of women in wartime. But it wasn't just about survival. The Soviet Union became a force of nature on the battlefield. The Red Army, though initially caught off guard, began to regroup and push back. The Battle of Stalingrad, which began in late 1942, became one of the most brutal and significant turning points of the war. The German forces, who had seemed unstoppable just months earlier, were finally pushed back in one of the most decisive battles in history. Stalingrad became a symbol of Soviet strength, of resilience in the face of unimaginable hardship. It was a victory that would set the stage for the Soviet Union to turn the tide of the war. Yet, for all the victories, the war came at an unfathomable cost. It's estimated that the Soviet Union lost around 27 million people, soldiers and civilians combined, during World War II. The sheer scale of death and destruction was something the Soviet Union would never fully recover from. Entire cities were wiped off the map, and the economy was stretched to its breaking point. The Red Army suffered heavy losses, but the people, ever resilient, kept fighting. And then, of course, there's the question of Stalin's role in all of this. His leadership during the war was critical, but it was also marked by cruelty. He was not above using ruthless tactics to secure victory. The Soviet people were often forced into impossible situations, with little regard for their well-being. The government used propaganda to keep morale high, but behind the scenes, people were being punished for the smallest of infractions. In some areas, civilians were sent to labor camps or executed for collaborating with the enemy, whether or not they actually had. Stalin's paranoia and desire for control continued to play a role in his decisions throughout the war. But the war also brought about some changes that would later be significant for the USSR. When the Soviet Union emerged victorious in 1945, they were seen as one of the world's great powers. It was a moment of intense pride. Victory in the Great Patriotic War was something every Soviet citizen had a part in, and it helped unite the country. This victory, in many ways, cemented Stalin's power and influence, even as the cost to the people had been so high. Historians still argue about how much credit Stalin should get for the Soviet Union's victory. Some believe he was a mastermind of wartime strategy, while others argue that the victory was a product of the Soviet people's sacrifice, not Stalin's leadership. One thing that's clear, though, is that the Soviet Union's experience in World War II fundamentally changed its identity. It wasn't just a superpower in the making, it was now a symbol of survival, resilience, and sacrifice. As we move on, remember this: World War II wasn't the only global conflict the Soviet Union would face. As the war wound down, another storm was brewing: the Cold War, a battle for global supremacy that would divide the world in ways few could have predicted. But that's a tale for another time. Now, let's shift gears and talk about the Soviet Union after the smoke of World War II cleared. The USSR had come out victorious, but the price of that victory was steep. Cities were in ruins, the economy was battered, and millions of Soviet citizens were grieving the loss of family members. Yet, despite all that devastation, the Soviet Union wasn't just going to crawl into the shadows of history, it had grand plans for the future. The Soviet leadership, now led by the aging Stalin, focused on rebuilding the nation. But here's the thing: rebuilding wasn't going to be a simple, peaceful task. Oh no. After the war, the government's focus was just as intense as it had been during the war itself, but now the USSR was eyeing a global position, competing with the West, particularly the United States. At home, the Soviet people were subjected to yet another round of struggles. While cities were rebuilt, food and goods were still in short supply. People had to dig in deep to survive. The government focused on heavy industrial projects, churning out steel and machinery as quickly as possible to get the country back on its feet. But the transition wasn't as smooth as they'd hoped. The resources and labor force needed for these projects were stretched thin, which meant that everyday Soviet citizens were still living in the shadows of scarcity. Much like in the 1930s, goods like clothes, electronics, and food were rationed, and the shelves in stores often stood empty. Yet, there was a strange sense of optimism during this period, despite the hardships. The war was over, the Soviet Union had emerged as a victorious superpower, and there was an almost palpable feeling of pride. The public was encouraged to focus on the Great Patriotic War, and people were constantly reminded of the sacrifices made for the greater good. The Soviet Union's new identity as a global power began to take shape, and for many people, the horror of Stalin's purges and the cost of the war were pushed aside in favor of celebrating their victory. But in the midst of this reconstruction, Stalin's iron grip didn't loosen. While the military and industrial complexes were rebuilt, there was still a pervasive atmosphere of fear. The paranoia that had defined Stalin's reign was still present in the early post-war years, with purges and mass arrests continuing to shake the country, even if they weren't as widespread as during the 1930s. Stalin was still very much the man in charge, and his shadow loomed over every aspect of Soviet life. Those who dared question the government's policies were silenced, and intellectuals and artists were still forced to conform to the rigid expectations of socialist realism. However, there were a few important changes starting to take shape. The most notable one? The rise of Nikita Khrushchev. In 1953, Stalin passed away, though his death remains shrouded in speculation. Some say it was natural causes, others wonder if foul play was involved, and Khrushchev emerged as his successor. Now, Khrushchev was no Stalin, that's for sure. In fact, some even argue that he was the polar opposite. Khrushchev's rise marked the beginning of what many would call the thaw in Soviet life. He was much more open to reforms than his predecessor had been, though, of course, he didn't suddenly make the USSR a democratic paradise. But Khrushchev did loosen some of Stalin's more oppressive policies, easing the restrictions on intellectuals and artists to some degree and calling for more attention to living standards. Still, Khrushchev's era was far from carefree. The Cold War tensions with the United States were reaching new heights, and the Soviet Union was in an arms race with the West. Khrushchev's administration marked a pivotal shift from focusing solely on heavy industry and war to also prioritizing consumer goods and food production. He even attempted some agricultural reforms, famously encouraging the expansion of farming into new areas. However, his attempts to grow crops in Siberia didn't exactly work out as planned. Those virgin lands didn't turn into breadbasket regions as hoped. Historians still argue over the impact of Khrushchev's reforms, with some claiming they were forward-thinking and others pointing to their lack of long-term success. Meanwhile, the rest of the world was watching. The Soviet Union, now recognized as a superpower, was entangled in a tense game of geopolitical chess with the United States. This was the beginning of the Cold War, and while the Soviet Union had emerged victorious in World War II, its victory didn't come without repercussions. The US and the USSR were now locked in an ideological battle for global dominance, each side trying to outdo the other in every possible way, from military might to political influence. The Cold War, of course, was more than just a war of words. It was a war of systems, ideologies, and even space. The two superpowers found themselves in a battle, not only on Earth, but also in the cosmos. This would come to be known as the space race. The Soviet Union, with its enormous push to show the world its power, launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, into space in 1957. It was a moment of triumph, a victory in the Cold War's ideological battle, but it also sparked a fierce competition with the United States. Historians still argue over whether the Soviet Union's early victories in space were a testament to Soviet strength or simply proof of their desperation to prove they could compete with the West. At the same time, the Soviet Union's leaders were busy trying to keep their citizens in line. While Khrushchev wasn't the iron-fisted tyrant Stalin had been, he still had his own methods of keeping control. He employed censorship, purged perceived enemies, and made sure that the people didn't stray too far from the party line. However, Khrushchev's leadership marked a break from Stalin's totalitarianism, laying the groundwork for later leaders like Mikhail Gorbachev to push for even greater reforms. In the end, the post-war period in the Soviet Union was a time of rebuilding, tension, and change. The nation had survived a war, but it was still living under the weight of its past, and the road to full recovery, both psychologically and economically, would be long and bumpy. Now that we've covered the post-war Soviet Union and the beginning of Khrushchev's leadership, let's dive deeper into a defining moment of the Cold War, the space race. This was a time when the world watched with bated breath as the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, competed to outdo each other in the stars. For the USSR, space was not just about science. It was a powerful tool for political prestige, a way to show the world that they were a technological and ideological force to be reckoned with. And in the early years of the space race, the Soviet Union made a stunning move that would leave the world in shock. The year was 1957, and the Soviet Union stunned the globe by launching the first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1, into orbit. Suddenly, the USSR had taken the lead in the most ambitious race humanity had ever known. This wasn't just a scientific achievement, it was a clear demonstration that the Soviet Union had the technological and scientific prowess to compete with, and even surpass, the United States. Sputnik's success sent shockwaves through the Western world. In the United States, the announcement of Sputnik's launch was met with disbelief, fear, and a certain amount of panic. How could the Soviet Union be so far ahead in a field that was supposed to be the domain of the West? To many Americans, it was a reminder that the USSR was a formidable opponent, both in space and on the global stage. Historians still argue about the true significance of Sputnik. Some see it as a symbol of Soviet technological superiority, while others argue that it was more of a wake-up call to the United States. Whatever the case, the launch of Sputnik marked the beginning of an intense rivalry between the two superpowers. The race to the stars became an extension of the Cold War itself, an ideological battle fought in the heavens. But it wasn't just about launching satellites. The Soviets didn't stop with Sputnik. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human to travel into space aboard Vostok 1. This was another huge triumph for the Soviet Union. Gagarin's flight was a bold statement that the USSR was the undisputed leader in space exploration. Gagarin became an instant hero, a symbol of Soviet achievement and the superiority of socialism. His flight lasted just 108 minutes, but the impact was lasting. The world had witnessed the Soviet Union's dominance in space, and it was hard for the West to ignore the fact that the USSR was ahead in this race. Yet, while the Soviets were basking in their early victories in space, the United States wasn't just sitting back. The US was playing catch-up, but that didn't mean they were giving up without a fight. In 1969, the United States accomplished what many had thought impossible. Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon. This moment, broadcast to millions of people around the world, was a powerful statement of American achievement and technological superiority. But let's not kid ourselves. The Soviet Union wasn't exactly backing down. They kept up the pressure with continued space missions, including the successful launch of their own space station, Salyut, in 1971. Even though the United States eventually claimed the moon landing as their ultimate victory, the space race wasn't just about who got to the moon first. It was about which country could prove to the world that their way of life, their political ideology, was the superior one. The Soviets believed that their socialist system had the power to push humanity to new heights, literally. For them, space wasn't just a scientific frontier, it was a battleground for ideological supremacy. But the race didn't come without its costs. The resources poured into the space program meant that other sectors of the Soviet economy were left in the dust. The USSR's space achievements were impressive, but they were not enough to distract from the growing inefficiencies at home. There's still a heated debate about the legacy of the Soviet space program. Some view it as one of the USSR's greatest achievements, proof that, even under a totalitarian regime, human ingenuity could still triumph. Others argue that it was a distraction from the real problems facing the Soviet Union, such as economic stagnation and political repression. And while the Soviets might have led the charge early on, the US eventually took the upper hand in the space race, solidifying their place as the undisputed leader in space exploration by the 1970s. Still, the Soviet Union's space achievements cannot be dismissed. Their early successes paved the way for global advancements in space exploration. Even today, Russia, successor to the Soviet Union, remains an important player in the world of space exploration, with its cosmonauts still working alongside astronauts from other nations. But in the context of the Cold War, space was much more than a technological venture. It was a war of images, a struggle for global influence, and a reflection of the ideological divide between East and West. As we move on from the stars and back down to Earth, let's talk about the other side of Soviet life during this time, the political climate. While Khrushchev may have initiated some reforms and a slight thaw in political repression, the Soviet state was still very much a highly controlled and authoritarian system. Despite its international triumphs, the USSR remained a place where the government's control over everyday life was never far from people's minds. Even if you were a successful cosmonaut or a factory worker, the ever-watchful eye of the state was always looming, making sure that nothing, absolutely nothing, went against the party line. Now that we've soared through the space race and zoomed past the stars, let's bring things back down to Earth, where the real complexities of Soviet life played out during the Cold War. While the USSR was busy proving itself in the great beyond, things at home weren't exactly peaceful. Khrushchev's leadership brought a thaw in some areas, but the Soviet Union was far from a utopia, especially by the 1960s and 1970s. The country was caught in a strange tension, a desire to modernize and showcase its global might, yet still clinging to the very ideals of control and repression that had defined its early days. At the heart of Soviet life during this period was the continued domination of the state in every facet of life, from work to education, from what you could say to whom you could associate with. The government kept a tight grip on its people. Sure, there were some cosmetic reforms under Khrushchev, like the partial de-Stalinization and an attempt to shift some economic priorities. But let's face it, the USSR was still an authoritarian state with little tolerance for dissent. This wasn't just about paranoia from the leaders, it was about control. The KGB, the secret police, were ever present, ensuring that no one stepped out of line. If you were caught speaking against the government or questioning the narrative, you could face imprisonment, exile, or worse. But, despite this, the Soviet Union wasn't entirely a place of sheer terror. Life still had its odd, quirky moments, especially in the urban areas. In the cities, people carried on with their lives, often focusing on the small pleasures that could be found within the cracks of this repressive system. The 1960s and 1970s were the heart of the Soviet stagnation period, an era where it seemed like the USSR was resting on its laurels. The government continued to push out propaganda that portrayed the Soviet Union as a workers' paradise, full of prosperity and unity. Yet, the reality on the ground was much more bleak. The economy was struggling. While it was still the second largest economy in the world, it was heavily centralized and inefficient. The Soviet system's over-reliance on heavy industry, combined with a stubborn refusal to innovate, meant that consumer goods, things like electronics, clothing, and even basic food items, remained in short supply. The black market, a relic of the Soviet past, was still thriving, and people learned to trade and barter just to get by. One of the most significant aspects of life in the Soviet Union during this time was the lack of personal freedom. You couldn't just hop on a plane and go wherever you wanted. You couldn't read books that were critical of the government and forget about criticizing Lenin, Stalin, or the party. Even cultural and intellectual life was subject to strict regulations. Books, films, and music had to fit the party's narrative, glorifying the workers, the party, and the Soviet system as a whole. If you were a writer, artist, or musician, you had to toe the line, or risk being silenced. But this didn't stop people from being creative in their own way. Despite the constant surveillance and repression, Soviet artists, filmmakers, and writers found ways to express themselves, often through subtle subversion. They'd weave hidden messages into their work, allowing them to comment on the restrictions they faced without being overtly political. It wasn't exactly an era of free expression, but there was a quiet underground resistance that ran parallel to the official state-sanctioned culture. One of the quirkiest things about Soviet society during the 1970s was the paradox of the Soviet way of life. On the one hand, the government emphasized hard work, loyalty to the state, and the pursuit of collective goals. On the other hand, Soviet citizens became masters of navigating the system to find small joys, whether it was a forbidden piece of Western music, a smuggled foreign film, or a cozy conversation about life beyond the Iron Curtain. People would huddle together, whispering about the world outside, dreaming of the day when they could break free of the tightly controlled system. And let's not forget about the gray economy. Officially, the state controlled nearly all production, but the black market flourished, where things like jeans, music albums, and even Western books were sold. If you had connections or a little extra cash, you could find ways to get your hands on some forbidden goods. The young people of the Soviet Union, many of whom had grown up during the war and Stalin's reign, embraced Western pop culture, despite the constant propaganda that portrayed the West as a land of corruption and decadence. They had a particular fondness for Western music, and bands like the Beatles became icons, even though their music was officially banned. But for all these pockets of subversion and the underground culture, life in the Soviet Union during the 1970s and 1980s was far from ideal. The country was still struggling under the weight of its own bureaucracy. Political freedom was non-existent, economic growth was stagnant, and many Soviet citizens began to feel the weariness of living under a regime that had promised utopia, but delivered only hardship. Historians still argue about the extent to which the Soviet Union's stagnation was due to the inherent flaws in its system, or the leadership of figures like Leonid Brezhnev, who came to power after Khrushchev and maintained the status quo. Some claim that the Soviet Union was simply too large and complex to manage effectively, while others believe that the leadership simply lacked the vision to push the country forward. But whatever the cause, by the 1980s, it was clear that the Soviet Union was at a crossroads. It had spent decades building a powerful military and industrial base, but internally, the country was crumbling under the weight of its own contradictions. The promise of communism had faded into a distant memory, and the Soviet people, long accustomed to the iron hand of the government, were starting to question their future. As we transition into the 1980s, the cracks in the Soviet system were becoming more and more visible, like deep fractures in an old, crumbling wall. The once mighty USSR, which had once seemed so invincible, was now struggling to keep its massive machinery of government and industry running smoothly. Enter Mikhail Gorbachev, who would be the man to try to fix the broken Soviet system, but not in the way anyone had expected. Gorbachev's rise to power in 1985 was like a breath of fresh air in the suffocating environment of the stagnating Soviet Union. Unlike his predecessors, who had either been entrenched in the old ways or had simply tried to keep things running, Gorbachev was a man of reform. He understood the USSR needed to change, but the question was, how? Gorbachev introduced two major reforms that would later shape the fate of the Soviet Union: perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness. These ideas were bold, but they came at a time when the Soviet Union was at its weakest. Perestroika was designed to revitalize the Soviet economy by shifting from centralized control to more market-oriented reforms. However, the idea of opening up the economy to more individual entrepreneurship, while still keeping the state's overarching control, was easier said than done. Many industries resisted change, and the economy continued to falter under the pressure of a global oil crash in the 1980s. While Gorbachev sought to move the country away from the bureaucratic inefficiency that had plagued it for years, the attempt to reform from within was like trying to fix a broken car while still driving it at full speed. Meanwhile, glasnost, Gorbachev's policy of openness, was intended to allow for more freedom of expression and to expose the problems of the Soviet system. It encouraged a more open dialogue within the country, allowing people to discuss politics and criticize the government in ways that were unimaginable just a few years earlier. There were even limited freedoms of the press, though this didn't mean Gorbachev was allowing full democracy, not by a long shot. It was more of a controlled openness, where people could voice their frustrations, but only within the framework that Gorbachev approved. But while these reforms may have been well-intentioned, they set off a chain of events that neither Gorbachev nor the Soviet leadership could control. The more people began to speak out, the more they realized just how deeply flawed the system was. Glasnost gave birth to a new sense of political awareness, but it also exposed the ugly truths about Soviet history, the government's corruption, and its failures in every area of society. People began to openly question not just the Communist Party, but the very foundations of the Soviet system. Historians still debate whether Gorbachev's reforms were too little, too late. Some argue that he was the last hope for the Soviet Union, trying desperately to save a collapsing empire. Others believe that he should have gone further, faster, especially when it came to political liberalization. One thing is certain, though: his efforts sparked a wave of change that would prove impossible to control. His decision to allow more freedom of expression and greater autonomy in the Soviet republics would later lead to the unraveling of the USSR itself. But it wasn't just internal pressures that were tearing the Soviet Union apart. Outside forces were playing a major role in the USSR's decline. By the late 1980s, the Cold War, which had defined global politics for over 40 years, was winding down. The United States, led by President Ronald Reagan, had waged a fierce arms race with the Soviets, and it had taken its toll on the Soviet economy. The Soviet Union was stuck in an expensive, never-ending arms race while trying to keep up with the US and at the same time maintain its presence in Eastern Europe and other regions around the world. But by the time Gorbachev came to power, the Soviet economy was barely holding on. Oil prices, a key source of Soviet revenue, were plummeting, and the cost of supporting the military and maintaining the global empire was becoming unsustainable. This external pressure, coupled with the internal strain from Gorbachev's reforms, created a perfect storm. In the late 1980s, tensions were high in the Eastern Bloc. The satellite states in Eastern Europe were increasingly seeking independence, emboldened by Gorbachev's promises of non-intervention in their affairs. In 1989, the Berlin Wall came down, signaling the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe and the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union. It was a dramatic moment that confirmed what many had feared for years. The Eastern Bloc was falling apart, and the USSR wasn't far behind. Even as Gorbachev pushed for reforms, the Communist Party continued to lose its grip on power. Nationalist movements in the Soviet republics, especially in the Baltic states and Ukraine, began to gain momentum. In 1991, after a failed coup attempt by hardline communists within the party, the Soviet Union officially began to break apart. By December of that year, Gorbachev resigned as president, and the Soviet Union was formally dissolved. The fall of the Soviet Union was a monumental event that reshaped the world. It marked the end of an era, the end of the Cold War, and the collapse of one of the most powerful empires in history. The aftermath was chaotic, as the newly independent republics struggled to transition from communist rule to democracy and market economies. Some fared better than others, but many were left in turmoil, facing economic hardship and political instability. The legacy of the Soviet Union is complex. Its achievements in space, its role in defeating Nazi Germany, and its early economic successes are undeniable. Yet, the human cost of its policies, the repressive regime, and the deep flaws within its system cannot be ignored. The USSR left behind a world that was fundamentally changed, and its collapse altered the course of history forever. As we move into the 1990s, the collapse of the Soviet Union wasn't just a political event. It was a seismic shift that rocked the very foundation of life for millions of people. The USSR had been one of the most powerful nations on Earth, an ideological opponent to the West, and a symbol of communist strength. But when it dissolved in 1991, the world watched as 15 newly independent countries emerged from the wreckage, each with its own challenges, hopes, and, of course, its baggage. The Soviet Union's end wasn't clean or easy. It was a complex and tumultuous breakup, filled with economic hardship, ethnic tensions, and political instability. For the people of the former Soviet states, life would never be the same. The immediate aftermath of the USSR's collapse was chaotic. In Russia, the successor state to the Soviet Union, people were facing a new reality. The government was in disarray, struggling to shift from a centrally planned economy to a market economy. The transition was nothing short of painful. Inflation skyrocketed, unemployment soared, and many Soviet-era industries were left in ruins. The once mighty state-owned factories that had pumped out military equipment, steel, and consumer goods now stood idle. Entire cities that had relied on these factories for jobs were left abandoned. Gorbachev's efforts at reform had failed to modernize the economy fast enough, and the sudden shift to capitalism didn't provide the immediate relief people had hoped for. The social fabric of the Soviet Union, which had been tightly controlled for decades, also began to unravel. The dissolution of the USSR led to a rise in nationalism in many of the newly independent republics. While some of these republics, like the Baltic states, embraced independence with open arms. Others, like Ukraine, Armenia, and Georgia, found themselves embroiled in conflict. Nationalism, long suppressed under Soviet rule, now came to the forefront, and ethnic tensions that had been simmering for years bubbled over into violent conflicts. The wars in places like Chechnya and the Nagorno-Karabakh region would be a grim reminder of the difficulty in transitioning from a unified state to separate, independent nations. In Russia, the situation was no less dire. The country's first post-Soviet leader, Boris Yeltsin, had inherited a mess of staggering proportions. Under Yeltsin, Russia made attempts at reforming its economy, but the path forward was rocky. The privatization of state-owned industries, often rushed and poorly executed, led to the rise of oligarchs, powerful business people who took advantage of the chaos to amass massive fortunes. Meanwhile, the average Russian citizen faced poverty, inequality, and a general sense of loss. The old Soviet way of life, with its jobs for life, state benefits, and stability, was gone. People didn't know what to expect in this new world of capitalism, where the rules were still being written. In the midst of this turmoil, there was also a sense of nostalgia. Some people, particularly older generations who had lived through the Soviet years, found themselves longing for the days of the USSR. Despite the hardships of the Stalin era and the authoritarian nature of the state, many Soviet citizens remembered the security, the sense of collective purpose, and the relatively low levels of unemployment that the Soviet system had provided. The memories of the victory in World War II, of the space race, and of the pride in the Soviet Union's global standing were still fresh in the minds of many. This nostalgia would shape Russia's political landscape for years to come, as some looked back on the USSR as a time of greatness, while others pushed forward with hopes for a better, more democratic future. Outside of Russia, the other former Soviet republics faced their own set of challenges. For many of them, the 1990s were marked by economic hardship and the struggle to establish their own identities as independent nations. Countries like Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan had to deal with not only economic problems but also political instability. The Soviet Union had been a massive, centralized power, and for these newly independent states, the sudden loss of that structure was jarring. They were left to find their way in the world, some looking to the West for economic and political models, others seeking to maintain ties with Russia. But even as the post-Soviet world was dealing with these growing pains, there was also a sense of possibility. The fall of the Soviet Union marked the end of one of the most repressive regimes in history, and for many people, this meant the chance to live in a more open, democratic society. Some republics embraced reforms, moved toward democracy, and sought to establish free market economies. Others, however, found themselves sliding back into authoritarianism, with leaders who sought to hold on to power at any cost. The legacy of the Soviet Union, its repression, its victories, and its failures, was still deeply embedded in the minds of the people who had lived under it. Historians still debate whether the dissolution of the Soviet Union was inevitable or whether it could have been avoided. Some argue that Gorbachev's reforms were too little, too late, and that the USSR was always doomed to collapse. Others suggest that the Soviet Union could have survived if it had embraced true democratic reforms and a genuine market economy earlier. Whatever the cause, the result was the same: a world transformed. The USSR was gone, and the countries that had once been part of it were now on their own. For Russia, the end of the Soviet Union marked the beginning of a new chapter, one that would be defined by an ongoing search for national identity and political stability. While the 1990s were a time of uncertainty and hardship, they also set the stage for the rise of a new kind of leadership in the 21st century, one that would look back to the Soviet past and forward to a new vision of Russia's place in the world. As we move further into the 2000s, the fall of the Soviet Union continued to reverberate throughout the former republics. But the country that had been the heart of the USSR, Russia, was navigating its own complex transition. The 1990s had been marked by the struggles of Boris Yeltsin's leadership, an era where Russia was attempting, sometimes painfully, to shift from its Soviet past to a more capitalist and democratic future. However, by the turn of the millennium, Russia was about to enter a new phase under a man who would change its course dramatically, Vladimir Putin. Putin's rise to power in 1999 wasn't exactly a revolution, but it was a decisive moment for Russia. He came into power after Yeltsin's resignation, inheriting a country in chaos. Russia, though officially independent, was still struggling with the legacies of its Soviet past, a crippled economy, widespread corruption, and a fractured national identity. But Putin, a former KGB officer, understood the deep desire many Russians had to restore the pride and stability that had defined the Soviet Union. He promised to restore Russia to its former glory, and in many ways he succeeded, though not without some darker consequences. Putin's first years in office were marked by a concerted effort to strengthen the central government, crack down on the oligarchs who had made fortunes during the chaos of the 1990s, and, perhaps most significantly, reassert Russia's power on the world stage. Putin moved quickly to consolidate power, reducing the influence of regional leaders and ensuring that the government had firm control over the country. He also worked to reinstate a sense of national pride, playing on the historical narratives that linked Russia's power to the legacy of the Soviet Union. But while Putin was keen on rebuilding Russia's strength, his approach to governance was less democratic than many had hoped. Under his leadership, political freedoms began to erode. The media was heavily controlled, with independent outlets either shut down or forced to toe the party line. Dissenters were often silenced, and opposition movements were marginalized. Critics of Putin's regime were subjected to harassment, imprisonment, or worse. In 2006, the assassination of journalist Anna Politkovskaya, who had been critical of the Kremlin, highlighted the dangers of speaking out against the government. Yet, despite these troubling trends, Putin was able to deliver economic stability, a marked improvement over the tumultuous years of the 1990s. Russia's economy grew, fueled by high oil prices, and many Russians began to experience a better standard of living. The once crippled industrial sectors started to recover, and Russia regained its place as a major global player. In the eyes of many Russians, Putin had succeeded in restoring the nation's strength, and they were willing to overlook the authoritarian tendencies that accompanied his rule. But there was always an underlying tension in this new Russia. While the country's economy was growing, much of the wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few, many of them former allies of Putin. The oligarchs who had flourished in the 1990s under Yeltsin were either brought into line with the government or exiled. At the same time, many ordinary Russians continued to face economic challenges, and the promise of a fully democratic Russia was never fully realized. Putin's Russia may have been more stable than the Yeltsin years, but it was also less free. Putin's policies were not just about internal stability. They were also about Russia's place in the world. In the early 2000s, the United States was still the dominant global power, and Russia, under Putin, sought to reassert itself on the world stage. Putin's government was keen on re-establishing Russia as a formidable power, particularly in relation to Europe and the United States. His foreign policy was marked by an increasing willingness to use force to assert Russia's interests. The most significant example of this was Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008, a move that sent shockwaves through the international community. Putin's government argued that the invasion was necessary to protect Russian-speaking populations in the region, but the move was widely condemned as an aggressive attempt to reassert Russia's influence over its former Soviet territories. However, the most significant turning point in Putin's leadership came in 2014, with the annexation of Crimea. The world watched in disbelief as Russian forces moved into Ukraine, seizing the Crimean Peninsula and sparking an international crisis. The West responded with sanctions, but Russia's actions were a clear signal that Putin was willing to defy international norms to restore Russia's perceived greatness. The annexation of Crimea also marked the beginning of a broader conflict in Ukraine, where Russia-backed separatists fought against Ukrainian forces in the eastern part of the country. The ongoing conflict, with its roots in the legacy of Soviet geopolitics, became a defining feature of Russia's foreign policy in the 21st century. This was a Russia that was reclaiming its power and its place in the world, but at a significant cost. Putin's actions were increasingly seen as a return to authoritarianism, and the international community grew wary of Russia's expansionist tendencies. The annexation of Crimea and Russia's involvement in the Syrian civil war further strained relations with the West. Meanwhile, Russia's domestic politics continued to be dominated by Putin, who had entrenched himself as the central figure in the country's governance. While the 2000s and 2010s were marked by a return to strength for Russia, it was a strength built on a foundation of political repression, limited freedoms, and a reassertion of Russian power that often came at the expense of international cooperation. As we enter the 2020s, Russia continues to grapple with the legacy of the Soviet Union, its triumphs, its failures, and the contradictions inherent in its history. The Soviet Union may be gone, but its impact on Russia's national identity, its politics, and its role in the world is still deeply felt. As we look at Russia in the 2020s, it becomes evident that the ghost of the Soviet Union still looms large over the country's identity and its political landscape. Despite the collapse of the USSR 3 decades ago, the former Soviet states, especially Russia, continue to wrestle with their complex legacies. While Putin has worked hard to craft a narrative of Russian resurgence, the reality remains tangled with the unresolved issues of the Soviet past. Let's examine the deep-rooted issues that Russia faces today, as it tries to reconcile the power of the Soviet legacy with the reality of the modern world. One of the most significant aspects of post-Soviet Russia is the nostalgia for the USSR, particularly among older generations who lived through its glory days. The Soviet Union, despite its flaws and eventual collapse, represented a time of power, unity, and strength on the global stage. For many, the collapse of the USSR marked not only the end of a political system, but also the loss of national pride. Under Putin, this nostalgia has been skillfully harnessed, especially as he seeks to establish a new Russian identity that draws on the USSR's sense of unity and power. Public monuments to Soviet heroes, references to Soviet victories, and even the celebration of key Soviet-era events, such as the victory over Nazi Germany in World War II, are all part of this attempt to reassert Russia's former glory. Putin's government has worked hard to rebuild Russia's image and its strength, particularly through military displays. The country's military modernization has been a central feature of Putin's rule. Modern weapons systems, military exercises, and an increasingly assertive foreign policy have sent a clear message to the world that Russia is once again a major player. The annexation of Crimea in 2014, along with Russia's support for separatists in eastern Ukraine, was a dramatic demonstration of this newfound confidence. But behind the military rhetoric and national pride lies an underlying concern. Russia's economy is still far from being a global powerhouse, and its dependence on oil and gas exports has left it vulnerable to market fluctuations. Economically, Russia's post-Soviet transition has been nothing short of turbulent. While Putin managed to stabilize the country in the early 2000s, many of the systemic problems that plagued the Soviet Union remain deeply ingrained in Russian society today. The oligarchic system, which was cemented in the 1990s, continues to thrive. A small group of wealthy businessmen and political elites control much of the country's resources, and wealth inequality remains stark. Meanwhile, ordinary Russians still face struggles with low wages, corruption, and a lack of opportunities outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg. The rural areas, in particular, still face significant economic challenges as they transition from a centralized economy to a market one. Furthermore, the corruption that plagued the Soviet Union never truly disappeared. In fact, the post-Soviet era has seen corruption thrive in many areas of Russian life, from the political class to the business world. While Putin's government has cracked down on some of the most egregious abuses of power, it has often turned a blind eye to corruption when it serves the interests of the Kremlin or its allies. The result is a state where the elite continue to thrive, while many citizens are left feeling disenfranchised and powerless. While Putin's Russia has experienced significant economic growth during his tenure, it has also faced its share of challenges. International sanctions, primarily imposed by the West in response to the annexation of Crimea, have crippled Russia's economy, limiting foreign investment and curtailing trade. This economic pressure has led to a tightening of domestic controls, with the Russian government increasingly stifling dissent and curbing civil liberties. The restrictions on freedom of speech, media independence, and political opposition have drawn increasing criticism from international human rights organizations and Western governments. Yet, within Russia, these measures are often justified by the need to maintain stability and safeguard national sovereignty, particularly in the face of foreign threats. Domestically, one of the most significant consequences of Putin's rule has been the stifling of political opposition. Dissent has been increasingly silenced through a combination of legal, economic, and extrajudicial means. Journalists and activists who criticize the government face harassment, imprisonment, or worse. One of the most high-profile cases in recent years was the poisoning of opposition leader Alexei Navalny, a vocal critic of Putin who was arrested and imprisoned after surviving an assassination attempt. These actions have cast a long shadow over Russia's democratic prospects and have led many to question whether the country is truly moving forward or simply sliding back into the authoritarian practices of its past. In foreign affairs, Russia's influence is still significant, but it is increasingly contested. Putin has positioned Russia as a key player on the global stage, particularly in the Middle East, where Russia has supported the regime of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad in the ongoing Syrian civil war. Russia's support for Assad, along with its involvement in other conflicts like Ukraine and the recent interference in Western elections, has drawn the ire of Western powers. Despite sanctions and diplomatic isolation, Russia has managed to maintain a powerful presence on the world stage, relying on alliances with countries like China and Iran to bolster its geopolitical influence. However, Russia's role in the global economy is far from secure. The country's reliance on oil and gas exports means that its economy remains vulnerable to fluctuations in global energy prices. With the world increasingly turning to renewable energy, Russia faces the challenge of diversifying its economy and finding new sources of growth. The question remains whether Putin's government can guide Russia into a new era of innovation and economic development, or whether it will continue to be held back by its dependence on outdated industries and systemic corruption. In sum, Russia in the 2020s is a nation at a crossroads. The country has made remarkable strides in terms of regaining global power and restoring a sense of pride, but these achievements have come with significant costs, politically, economically, and socially. The Soviet Union may be gone, but the legacy of its centralized control, its power dynamics, and its sense of national pride continues to shape the course of Russia's future. As the country moves forward, it will have to navigate the delicate balance between looking back at its Soviet past and forging a new path in the modern world. As Russia continues to grapple with the deep scars of its Soviet past, the former republics of the USSR have also had their own paths to chart in the post-Soviet world. While the collapse of the Soviet Union may have been the beginning of a new chapter for these countries, it didn't mean an instant transformation into stable, democratic nations. In fact, many of the newly independent republics have faced their own unique challenges as they try to balance their Soviet legacies with the demands of independence, often struggling with their national identities, economic struggles, and political upheaval. Take the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. These nations, unlike much of the former Soviet Union, quickly moved towards European integration, seeking membership in organizations like the European Union and NATO. Their decision to break away from Russia's sphere of influence was a crucial moment in the post-Soviet world. These countries experienced economic recovery more quickly than others, having embraced market economies and democratic governance. However, their independence came at a cost, particularly in terms of relations with Russia. The Russian government has not been pleased with the westernization of these former Soviet republics, and tensions between Russia and the Baltics remain high. The situation in other former Soviet republics, particularly in Central Asia and the Caucasus, has been more complex. Countries like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan have largely stayed within Russia's orbit, maintaining close economic and political ties with the Kremlin. However, their political systems have been marked by strong autocratic leadership, as seen in the long reign of leaders like Nursultan Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan and Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedow in Turkmenistan. These countries have struggled to make the leap to true democracy, and many citizens still live under authoritarian regimes where opposition is stifled, media freedom is restricted, and the influence of former Soviet institutions remains entrenched. In the Caucasus, nations like Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia have experienced significant turmoil. The conflicts in Nagorno-Karabakh, a territorial dispute between Armenia and Azerbaijan, have been a constant source of instability since the Soviet Union's collapse. In addition to these ethnic tensions, these countries have also had to contend with a difficult balance between Russia's influence and their own aspirations for closer ties with the West. Russia's intervention in Georgia's separatist regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, coupled with its annexation of Crimea in 2014, has left these countries in a precarious geopolitical position, unsure of their future relationship with both Russia and NATO. Ukraine's path has been one of the most contentious in the post-Soviet world. The Ukrainian people have long had a complex relationship with Russia, influenced by centuries of shared history, yet marked by significant tensions and divisions. The 2004 Orange Revolution, in which Ukrainians protested a rigged election and demanded a more democratic system, was a pivotal moment in the country's history. But it wasn't until the 2014 Maidan Revolution, which led to the ousting of pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych, that the country truly began to break away from Russia's grip. This revolution ignited a violent response from Russia, resulting in the annexation of Crimea and the ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine between Russian-backed separatists and Ukrainian forces. For Ukraine, the struggle for independence has been a battle not only against Russian influence, but also against internal divisions. While many Ukrainians look westward, seeking greater integration with Europe, others, particularly in the east of the country, feel a stronger connection to Russia and its traditions. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine has not only devastated the country, but also polarized its people, and as it stands, it remains a hotbed of geopolitical tension. The annexation of Crimea and Russia's continued military support for separatists in Donetsk and Luhansk have effectively frozen relations between Russia and Ukraine for the foreseeable future. Historians continue to debate whether Russia could have kept the Soviet Union intact if it had made greater efforts to accommodate the desires of its republics for autonomy. Some argue that Gorbachev's reforms, especially Glasnost and Perestroika, could have provided the foundation for a more federalized Soviet system that would have allowed for more local control while keeping the Union intact. Others believe that the centrifugal forces of nationalism were too strong, particularly in the non-Russian republics, and that the Soviet Union was doomed to collapse under its own contradictions, no matter what Gorbachev or any other leader did. One thing is clear, however: the dissolution of the Soviet Union created a massive geopolitical void, and while Russia has largely reclaimed its role as a regional power, the smaller republics have had to carve out their own paths, often at great cost. The legacy of Soviet rule is still felt today in these countries, particularly in the lingering influence of Russian-speaking populations, Soviet-era infrastructure, and the complex political and economic systems that remain in place. These republics, despite their newfound independence, still live under the shadow of the Soviet Union, as they try to chart their own destinies in a world that has changed rapidly in the past 3 decades. As we look at these countries today, we can see that the post-Soviet world is still very much a work in progress. Some republics have embraced the promise of democracy and the free market, while others remain mired in authoritarianism, nationalism, and instability. The road to independence for these nations has been fraught with challenges, and it is clear that their future paths will be shaped by their complex relationships with Russia, the West, and the deep legacies of the Soviet Union that continue to influence their political, cultural, and economic systems. As we continue exploring the post-Soviet world, it becomes apparent that the legacy of the USSR is not merely a chapter in history. It is an ongoing influence that continues to shape the lives of millions, even decades after the Soviet Union's collapse. One of the most persistent aspects of the Soviet legacy is the way it continues to impact Russia's relationships with its neighbors and the rest of the world. Whether it's the strategic importance of former Soviet republics or the lingering psychological impact on the Russian people, the echoes of the Soviet Union resonate far beyond the borders of the former empire. Let's begin with Russia's complex relationship with its former Soviet republics. For many of these countries, independence from the USSR didn't mean immediate peace or stability. In fact, many of them still live in the shadow of Russian influence. Take the situation in Central Asia. Countries like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan, which were once tightly bound to Moscow's policies, still find themselves economically and politically reliant on Russia. Russia provides much-needed energy and trade routes for these nations, and for some, Russia remains a major security partner, especially as they deal with both internal and external pressures. The presence of Russian military bases in some of these countries, such as Kyrgyzstan, also underscores how entrenched Moscow's influence remains in the region. At the same time, however, these countries are also keen to assert their independence, often balancing Russia's influence with aspirations of further integration into international bodies like the European Union or the United Nations. This delicate balance is never easy to maintain. It's like trying to walk a tightrope between the old Soviet power and the new world of globalization, often caught between the demands of Russia and the desires of their own people for democratic reforms and prosperity. The legacy of Soviet economic policies, too, has left these nations grappling with problems like inefficiency, corruption, and poor infrastructure. Many of these states have made strides toward modernization and economic reform, but the scars of Soviet centralization and bureaucracy still hinder their growth. The Caucasus region presents another complicated case. Countries like Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan have long struggled to navigate their relationships with both Russia and the West. The history of these nations is marred by conflict, both ethnic and territorial, and the legacy of Soviet rule in this region is no less complex. The USSR tried to suppress ethnic tensions in the Caucasus by drawing arbitrary borders and centralizing control, but after its collapse, these tensions resurfaced in violent ways. In the case of Armenia and Azerbaijan, the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict continues to define their relationships with each other and with Russia. Armenia, a historically Orthodox Christian nation, has strong ties with Russia, while Azerbaijan, a majority Muslim country, has fostered closer ties with Turkey and the West. The struggle for regional dominance in this part of the world is a direct result of the power vacuum left after the USSR's collapse. But it's not just about geopolitics. The USSR's collapse has also created a unique cultural shift across its former republics. For generations, the people in these countries lived under Soviet rule, absorbing the ideals of socialism, Marxism, and the Soviet identity. Even today, many people in the former republics feel torn between their Soviet past and their desire for a national identity that is separate from Russia. While younger generations may seek out Western ideas and lifestyles, older generations often reminisce about the relative stability and security they experienced during the Soviet era. In Russia, this nostalgia for the Soviet past is particularly pronounced. The sense of unity and purpose that defined the USSR, despite its authoritarianism and repression, still resonates with many older Russians who lived through its heyday. The notion of a strong, unified Soviet Union, one that stood up to the United States and other global powers, continues to captivate the national imagination. In fact, this sense of nostalgia is a central element of Putin's political strategy. By evoking the legacy of the Soviet Union, he taps into a deep-seated longing for the past, even as he builds a future based on Russia's military strength and authoritarian governance. For many Russians, the Soviet Union represents a time of national pride, technological achievement, such as the space race, and global influence. However, there's a stark contrast in how this nostalgia plays out in the former Soviet republics. While some may look back fondly on the Soviet era for the security it provided, others view it with deep resentment, particularly because of the heavy-handed political control, forced collectivization, and the suppression of local cultures. This cultural rift has been exacerbated by the new national identities that have emerged in the post-Soviet states. Countries like Ukraine, for example, have sought to break free from Russia's shadow, emphasizing their unique cultural heritage and language. Yet, even in these countries, Soviet-era symbols, language, and infrastructure continue to hold sway in some areas. It's a reflection of how the Soviet Union's legacy was not only political, but deeply embedded in the social and cultural fabric of the region. The role of the Russian Orthodox Church in modern-day Russia also reflects the complex interplay between the past and the present. After decades of Soviet anti-religious policies, the Russian Orthodox Church has experienced a resurgence, becoming a key player in Russian politics and national identity. Many Russians, particularly those who yearn for the moral certainty of the Soviet era, find comfort in the Church's teachings, which are closely intertwined with Russian nationalism and the state's growing authoritarianism. This religious revival, along with Putin's attempts to merge the state with the Orthodox Church, has added another layer to the debate about Russia's future. For the former Soviet republics, the path forward is equally complex. Some, like the Baltic states, have moved firmly towards Europe, embracing the values of democracy, free markets, and individual freedoms. Others, like Belarus, remain closely aligned with Russia, with President Alexander Lukashenko's regime continuing to maintain a tight grip on power. The struggle for balance between Soviet-era ties and aspirations for Western integration is a delicate one, as each country navigates the choppy waters of national identity, economic development, and regional politics. As the 21st century progresses, the legacy of the Soviet Union will continue to shape the politics and cultures of the post-Soviet space. Whether it's in Russia's increasing authoritarianism, the lingering regional conflicts in places like Ukraine and the Caucasus, or the complicated dance of post-Soviet nationalism and European integration, the echoes of the USSR remain loud. While the Soviet Union may no longer exist, its influence is far from over. The question remains, will these former Soviet republics, including Russia, be able to create their own futures, free from the weight of their shared past? Or will the shadows of the Soviet Union continue to define their paths for decades to come? As we approach the final stages of our journey through the history and legacy of the Soviet Union, we're faced with the inevitable question: what does the collapse of the USSR mean for the world today? The dissolution of one of the 20th century's most powerful empires reshaped the political landscape, and its aftermath has had profound implications not just for Russia and the former Soviet republics, but for global politics, security, and economics. The end of the Soviet Union marked the end of the Cold War, but it didn't bring an end to global tensions. In fact, it was only the beginning of a new era of uncertainty, characterized by the rise of new challenges, old rivalries, and a constantly shifting geopolitical balance. Let's start by acknowledging the immediate aftermath of the Soviet collapse. When the USSR dissolved in 1991, the world was left with a power vacuum. For the United States and its allies, the fall of the Soviet Union was seen as a moment of victory, a triumph of democracy and capitalism over communism and authoritarianism. The Cold War had ended, and many hoped that the world would enter a new era of peace and cooperation. In reality, the transition was much messier. The end of the Soviet Union did not create a fully stable world order. Instead, it gave rise to new conflicts and a host of complicated relationships between former Soviet states and their new independent identities. One of the first challenges after the collapse was the security concerns raised by the presence of nuclear weapons in former Soviet states. The Soviet Union had maintained one of the world's largest nuclear arsenals, and when the USSR broke up, it left several newly independent countries, like Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus, with nuclear weapons on their soil. The risk of these weapons falling into the wrong hands was a serious global concern. In 1994, through the Budapest Memorandum, these nations agreed to give up their nuclear stockpiles in exchange for security guarantees from the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia. This agreement was significant. It marked a moment of cooperation and diplomacy that led to the denuclearization of former Soviet republics. However, as we've seen in recent years, the security of post-Soviet nations has remained a fraught issue, particularly for Ukraine, where Russian aggression has reignited fears of instability and territorial loss. On the political front, the collapse of the USSR sparked a flurry of new national identities. Countries like Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania quickly aligned themselves with Europe, eager to join the European Union and NATO to secure their sovereignty and embrace democratic reforms. The Baltic states sought to distance themselves from Russia, and their integration into Western institutions was seen as a beacon of success for countries emerging from the Soviet shadow. Their journey, however, was not without challenges, as Russia has repeatedly pushed back against the expansion of Western influence on its borders. Meanwhile, Russia itself, under Boris Yeltsin's leadership in the 1990s, faced the tumultuous task of transitioning from a centralized, state-controlled system to a market-oriented economy. The initial years of post-Soviet Russia were marked by chaos, a crumbling economy, rampant corruption, privatization that enriched a small group of oligarchs while leaving millions in poverty, and a general sense of disillusionment. As the economy struggled and political instability soared, it became increasingly clear that the dream of a democratic Russia was far from realized. In the 2000s, as Vladimir Putin rose to power, Russia started to stabilize, at least on the surface. With rising oil prices and an increasingly centralized government, Putin's Russia gained more control over its economy, its resources, and its military. But while Russia enjoyed economic growth, its political system became more authoritarian. Putin's government tightly controlled the media, restricted political opposition, and increasingly used state power to suppress dissent. Under Putin, Russia has been accused of engaging in various forms of political repression, including the silencing of journalists, opposition leaders, and activists. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 and Russia's military intervention in Ukraine have only deepened the tension between Russia and the West, reigniting Cold War-era animosities. From a global perspective, the collapse of the Soviet Union also reshaped the world's power dynamics. While the US emerged as the sole superpower, the unipolar moment was short-lived. As the 21st century progressed, new global powers, China, India, and others, began to emerge. These countries have sought to assert themselves on the world stage, challenging US dominance in trade, military power, and influence. The rise of China, in particular, has shifted global politics, as it now competes with the US for economic and geopolitical dominance. Russia, under Putin, has made efforts to reassert itself as a global power, but it has done so through aggressive tactics, including the annexation of Crimea, military interventions in Syria, and the use of cyber attacks. One of the most significant legacies of the Soviet Union's collapse has been the emergence of hybrid warfare and information battles. Russia has become notorious for using modern technology to influence political events worldwide, including election interference and cyber attacks. The use of disinformation campaigns, particularly through social media and online platforms, has become one of the defining features of contemporary Russian politics. This new form of warfare is less about tanks and missiles, and more about manipulating narratives and sowing discord in rival nations. It has raised new questions about the role of technology in modern geopolitics and the extent to which states can control and influence public opinion. The end of the Soviet Union also had lasting effects on the global economy. While the immediate aftermath saw the rise of market economies in former Soviet states, the road to prosperity has been uneven. The collapse of the USSR led to the privatization of state-owned industries, but in many cases, this process was rushed and riddled with corruption. In Russia, this led to the rise of the oligarchs, individuals who gained control of major sectors of the economy and who wielded significant political power. Many of the newly independent republics also struggled to transition from a planned economy to a market economy, facing high inflation, unemployment, and poverty. It wasn't until the 2000s that some of these countries began to stabilize and grow economically, with Russia at the forefront due to its natural resources, particularly oil and gas. In conclusion, the collapse of the Soviet Union was a defining moment in modern history. It ended an era of bipolar global politics, ushering in a new world order marked by the rise of new powers and shifting alliances. The post-Soviet world is one of contradictions, a world where the former Soviet republics have moved in vastly different directions, some embracing democracy and market economies, while others have fallen into authoritarianism and economic stagnation. Russia, for its part, continues to struggle with its own identity, caught between its Soviet legacy and the demands of modern governance. The future remains uncertain, but one thing is clear: the influence of the Soviet Union will continue to as we reach the final part of our exploration into the legacy of the Soviet Union. We reflect on the broader implications of its collapse for both the nations that emerged from its ashes and for the world at large. While we've discussed the many challenges these post-Soviet nations have faced, it's important to also recognize the moments of hope and transformation that have defined their journeys. The collapse of the Soviet Union was not just a tragic end, it was also an opportunity for change, growth, and new beginnings. For the former Soviet republics, the journey has been anything but simple. From the outset, independence was a double-edged sword. While some countries, such as the Baltic states, embraced the challenge of building new, democratic systems, others found themselves in the midst of political chaos, conflict, and economic hardship. Yet, over time, we've seen moments of genuine progress. The idea of national sovereignty and self-determination, which was once suppressed under Soviet rule, has become a cornerstone of many post-Soviet nations. Even those countries with tumultuous histories of authoritarianism and war, such as Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, have made strides in defining themselves outside the shadow of their former Soviet overlords. In Ukraine, for instance, despite the ongoing war with Russia and the divisive challenges of internal politics, the country has shown remarkable resilience. The Ukrainian people, particularly since the 2014 Maidan Revolution, have fought to create a more democratic society, one that is independent of Russian influence. Although the conflict with Russia continues, with Russia's annexation of Crimea and support for separatist movements in eastern Ukraine, Ukraine's aspirations to align itself with Europe and embrace democratic values remain unwavering. Despite the hardship and sacrifices, Ukraine stands as a testament to the persistence of a people who refuse to be bound by their Soviet past. In the heart of Central Asia, countries like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan have slowly modernized, with Kazakhstan, in particular, positioning itself as a regional leader in trade and diplomacy. While the region remains under the influence of Russia to some degree, it has also sought to chart its own course, balancing relations with Russia, China, and the West. The challenges in Central Asia, though distinct, reflect the broader theme of post-Soviet struggle: how to move from the centralized, state-controlled systems of the USSR to more open, market-oriented economies and political systems. It's a slow and arduous process, but there are signs of improvement, even in these former Soviet republics that were once seen as entirely under Moscow's thumb. Yet, not all post-Soviet nations have thrived. Belarus, often called Europe's last dictatorship, continues to be ruled with an iron fist by President Alexander Lukashenko, who has clung to power through repression, election rigging, and violence against his own people. While many former Soviet republics sought to free themselves from Moscow's grasp, Belarus has remained firmly aligned with Russia, even as it faces widespread protests and condemnation from the international community. The crackdown on dissent, the suppression of free speech, and the unrelenting control of the media reflect a reality that remains too familiar for many who lived under Soviet rule. Russia's position in the post-Soviet world, too, has evolved, and not necessarily for the better. Under Putin's leadership, Russia has reasserted itself as a global power, but this has come at a high cost. The world has watched as Russia has become increasingly authoritarian, suppressing political freedoms, manipulating the media, and quashing opposition. Internationally, Russia has taken a more aggressive stance, from its military actions in Ukraine to its intervention in Syria, all while utilizing cyber warfare and information manipulation to further its global ambitions. The Russian people, particularly under Putin, are caught in the tension of a growing sense of national pride, built on nostalgia for Soviet greatness, and the realities of living under an increasingly repressive government. The Soviet Union's collapse was also a moment of profound change in global geopolitics. The end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the USSR did not bring about the long-awaited peace dividend. Instead, the 1990s were marked by new conflicts, power shifts, and the emergence of new global challenges. The world watched as the United States stepped into the role of the world's sole superpower. But this unipolar moment did not last. The rise of China, the war on terror, and the economic and political instability of the Middle East all signaled the changing nature of global power. The 21st century is now marked by a return to great power competition, with the US facing renewed challenges from Russia and China. The legacies of the Cold War, as well as the unresolved tensions between East and West, continue to affect the global order. The dissolution of the Soviet Union also sparked debates about the viability of socialism in the modern world. While the USSR's failure as a socialist state was a major blow to Marxist-Leninist ideals, many former Soviet republics still struggle with the remnants of socialist economic policies and centralized planning. However, the ideological vacuum left by the collapse of the USSR has been filled by various movements, some looking back to socialism, others embracing capitalism, and others still striving for a hybrid model. The debate over the merits of state control versus market freedom is far from over, and it continues to shape the political and economic landscapes of countries across the former Soviet space. The collapse of the Soviet Union also gave rise to new forms of conflict, particularly within the context of nationalism. The rise of national identity, once suppressed by Soviet policy, has been a driving force in post-Soviet politics. Ethnic conflicts, like those in Georgia and Armenia, have been fueled by the desire for national autonomy, while the movement towards Western integration, particularly in the case of Ukraine, has been met with resistance from Russia. Nationalism, once used as a tool by the Soviet Union to suppress diversity, is now a force that many nations are grappling with as they seek to forge their own futures. Finally, as we reflect on the Soviet legacy, we must acknowledge the people who lived through it all. The everyday lives of Soviet citizens, whether they were workers, soldiers, scientists, or students, remain at the heart of the story. The Soviet Union may no longer exist, but its legacy is deeply embedded in the memories of those who lived through it. They remember the sacrifices, the struggles, and the moments of triumph. And for the generations that followed, the echoes of the Soviet past continue to shape their identities, their dreams, and their futures. The story of the Soviet Union's collapse is not a simple one. It is a story of power, loss, transformation, and, ultimately, resilience. The world that emerged from the ashes of the USSR is still evolving, and the legacy of the Soviet Union, both the good and the bad, remains a powerful force shaping the lives of millions.